You on? Testing, 1, 2. Awesome.
To Raymond Thomas's dissertation defense seminar. I want to welcome everybody here today. All of you sitting over on this side, just think 6 years ago, he was kind of sitting in the same position. And after a lot of hard work and sweat, and I'm sure a couple of cuss words here and there, he's made it to this point. We'll see if we can get him over the final hurdle. So welcome very much, and hope you will interact and ask as many questions as possible. Raymond's parents, welcome as well. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being able to run over this last milestone too. Students and faculty members, thank you very much as well. Raymond graduated from Prairie View in 2018, and then immediately started here in 2020, received his Master's of Science degree under Dr. Steve Harris, looking at the wheat price shocks. When he decided to continue on for his PhD, he had a really exciting opportunity to be part of the National Science Foundation National Research Traineeship in food, energy, and water system issues. So working on an interdisciplinary group of people on his dissertation. And after that completed, he's here finishing up his dissertation. So how will we proceed today? We're going to first allow Raymond to give his seminar presentation. And at the end of that, we'll open it up to the entire room for questions and anything you want for clarification, anything related to this presentation. Then I'm going to ask everyone to leave. And then the committee will do our review of his work, and we'll be able to ask him questions broader than just what he's doing on his dissertation, but on macro, micro theory, what's your favorite flavor of soup, questions like this before we come to a decision on his overall performance and where we stand with the dissertation. So that's how we'll proceed. I'm going to turn it over to you, Raymond.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, okay. Yes, let me do that. Thank you very much, Dr. Dalton, for opening up today's presentation for me. Thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon. I'm extremely excited to share my work that I've been, cracking away at these past few years in my PhD program. It's been filled with a lot of ups and downs, but I think that the project that I've put together has a lot of useful implications for the landscape of conservation, agriculture, and conservation practices in agriculture in the U.S. So without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. Let me make sure that that's on. Oh, right. There we go. And so just a general outline of the presentation today. I'll start with a general introduction on my topic area, talk to you about why it's important, why it's relevant, and hopefully give you some insights on how I hope to contribute to research in that area. Following that, we will dive into essay 1 of my presentation, looking at the use and intensity of conservation carbon farming practices in the U.S., followed by an evaluation of the welfare implications of those practices, understanding how they affect farms, net farm income, finances, bottom line, things of that nature. And lastly, capping it off with an overview of agricultural policy in the U.S. in an attempt to understand how policy reform has impacted conservation behavior over time. So research on climate change has identified greenhouse gas emissions as a major threat to the welfare of the environment and therefore the welfare of agricultural production. And in response to this, there's been a myriad of national and global level initiatives focused on addressing these particular issues. And so when we look at the contributions to greenhouse gas emissions across sectors, one thing we are aware of that agriculture is that we are in no way the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. However, some emissions from agricultural production are truthfully just unavoidable. According to the USDA in 2018, agriculture in the U.S. contributed to roughly 11% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and that's been pretty consistent even today. Looking at the updated numbers from 2021 report, we're still seeing about a 10.6% contribution to the overall U.S. emissions, mainly coming in the form of direct methane and direct nitrous oxide, as well as some contributions toward the CO2 and indirect utility emissions. And so when we look at the landscape of climate change in the agriculture sector, research in this area tends to focus on addressing 3 broad areas. The first is reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production. The second is adapting new production practices in order to adapt to changing climate conditions. And of course, the third is the ongoing effort and truthfully the true mission of agriculture in the country, which is continuing to meet the food demand of a growing population. Now, when we're looking at the climate change aspect of research, the agriculture sector is unique because it is the only sector with the potential to offset emissions from other adjacent sectors. And this is done through the implementation of land management practices that store carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions in the soil or terrestrial vegetation. These include practices such as no-till, leaving the land undisturbed in between production years, applying growing cover crops alongside staple crops, nutrient management strategies, as well as soil testing protocols, just to name a few. Agriculture carbon credits have become a really hot button topic in recent times. We explored in the US the idea of a carbon credit system back in 2008, roughly. However, that system had unfortunate challenges that made full sort of implementation at that time very less feasible. But these carbon credit systems that we're looking at today are speculated to be able to be major contributors to achieving carbon neutrality goals. And so the cool thing about these practices is not only do they potentially have the opportunity to assist in sequestering carbon and managing emissions, but they also have the opportunity to potentially benefit the environment through improving soil and water quality. However, a lot of these practices are very cost or resource intensive, and they require farmers to make decisions about how to change their input use and how to reallocate their farmland in order to still be able to produce at a high level while also contributing to conservation efforts. And so encouraging the use of these practices requires an understanding of the potential barriers for farmers to begin implementing and using them on a regular basis, as well as insight into the welfare implications. Because of the potential cost changes and input changes, how do we need to figure out ways to support farmers making this transition? Now, as I mentioned earlier, there have been a lot of national and global level initiatives that have come together in an attempt to help encourage the use of these practices in order to benefit the environment. And with that being said, assessing the effectiveness of these different government, federal programs is important in order to make sure that we're able to refine programs in the future to meet any environmental quality standards and benefits that we are trying to achieve. And so with that being said, my dissertation has three primary objectives. The first is to understand the current landscape of the use of conservation management practices. We want to see what practices are being used on a wide spectrum, why certain farmers are more or less likely to use certain practices, which would give us insight into some of the challenges and barriers that they might face. Going from there, we want to evaluate the welfare implications for conservation management practices. We want to understand that how using these practices affects the farm's bottom line and their overall financial welfare in order to understand what mechanisms need to be structured in order to effectively support them. And finally, we want to understand the impact of federal policy and programs on conservation behaviors. We've had a number of different programs that have come in and out of inception, rotation through the USDA and different federal agencies, and we want to take a chance to understand how these programs are structured and whether or not the structure of these programs is having an effect on the conservation behaviors in the United States. And so with that, we'll go ahead and begin by diving into Essay 1, where I will be analyzing the use and intensity of carbon farming practices in the US. So as mentioned at the beginning, carbon farming practices focus on storing carbon in soil or terrestrial vegetation, and implementing these practices not only acts as emission sink opportunities, but also opportunities to improve the soil and water qualities in the environment. And research that has suggested this, as we see through time back in the 2008 era when we were first looking at carbon credit systems and things of that nature, and even now. Currently, there are about 32 practices identified by the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service as carbon friendly, meaning that these are practices that do contribute to assisting in reducing overall carbon emissions in the atmosphere. However, constraints such as capital, production costs, and other things like technology can create challenges for farmers when deciding to or not to implement these practices. And because of this, there have been efforts by both the public and the private sector to find ways and mechanisms with which to incentivize farmers. Now, one thing that the research has shown throughout the years is that even in the presence of incentives, not all farmers will be willing to implement certain practices in their production. And thus, there's a need to understand the farmer and farm characteristics, as well as the environmental factors that contribute to a farm willingness or likelihood of adopting and using certain carbon farming practices. Which leads us to our research question and objectives for Essay 1. We want to know what factors impact the use of carbon farming conservation practices in the United States. And our goal is to identify the major carbon farming practices currently used, identify the farm and farm characteristics that influence their use, and identify the environmental factors that influence their use. So when we take a look at the literature, we can see that this problem has been explored previously and is currently still a major area of research interest. Research has shown that things such as a farmer's racial ethnic identity may contribute to their willingness to adopt or not to adopt certain practices, given their relationship with the institutional structures in their country of origin, as well as things such as soil quality, right? What's the erodibility classification of the land? Farm size has also been explored as a major contributor to influencing farm use of these practices, comparing larger farms to smaller farms, understanding how land distribution contributes to conservation practice use in terms of what percentage of their overall farmland is dedicated to crops and things of that nature. As well as access to education on the proper use of different management strategies. The biggest thing that we want to take away from the literature here is the method. Now, when evaluating these questions, researchers have often opted to use what's known as a discrete choice analysis method, in which you attempt to estimate the likelihood of a decision being made by an observation or by an individual based on their unique characteristics and environmental factors. And so with that being said, that is also going to be the approach we use today in this research. So when we think about this problem conceptually, farmers' willingness to or likelihood of using a certain practice or given set of practice is really a function of the utility they anticipate receiving from that combination of practices. That combination of practices is simply just the overall utility derived from each individual practice within a certain combination, right? So what's my utility from implementing no-till along with something like crop rotation or cover crops? Farmers weigh this against their expected direct monetary and indirect non-monetary benefits that they could potentially receive from using these practices. When we talk about direct monetary benefits, we talk about the opportunity for subsidies or direct payments, and non-monetary benefits, we talk about overall quality of the environment that could help encourage greater production yield and quality in the future. And this is typically all determined by a farmer's perception given their specific demographic variables as well as their production environment. And so following the literature, we decided to evaluate and estimate this question using a multinomial logit model. This model will allow us to identify and estimate the likelihood that a farm or farmer uses a particular set of conservation practices given their specific demographic variables such as age, education, farm size, land use ownership ratio, and things of that nature, as well as the environmental factors that they're growing under. What's their climate like? What's their weather like? What are the soil characteristics that they're growing in? And we anticipate that, and the goal here is to find a greater understanding of how these individual factors overall lead to an increased or decreased likelihood of using certain combination of practices. So the data from this research and the data from this overall dissertation comes from the United States Department of Agriculture, Agricultural Resource Management Survey, particularly the phase 1 and 2 of this survey. This is the premier survey in the US that contains information on farm production practices as well as farmer and farm characteristics. We also are going to be implementing weather data from the PRISM weather database, which will give us monthly county level data, allowing us to calculate things such as degree days, understanding the temperatures that farms are being exposed to in their growing conditions, as well as their cumulative precipitation. And lastly, we're getting soil data from the GSERGO database from the Natural Resource Conservation Service in order to understand things such as what's the productivity level of the soil on the farm, what's the erosion level, what is the potential slope that farms are going to be having to grow on, understanding their agronomic growing conditions. From the USDA ARMS survey, we were able to identify 4 practices consistently used through time. These practices include reduced or no-till, which is simply the process of between years of production, disturbing the soil as little as possible. Crop rotation, which involves cycling your staple crop with other crops as well in order to introduce new different forms of terrestrial vegetation and nutrients. Cover crops doing something similar, but rather than being switched out with your primary crop, being grown alongside your primary crop. And lastly, land use change, which involves maybe taking land out of production and into another use such as pasture or rangeland for cattle or other livestock. So from those particular variables, for those particular practices, we were able to take a look across our data set in order to find which practices were being used at which percentage level. Here you can see that reduced and no-till practices are often used, are collectively now being used at higher rates than conventional tillage practices on their own. And when it comes to some of our alternative practices, we can see that crop rotation paired with any other tillage practice is a very common bundle used by farmers in agricultural production. Now, when I say bundle, what I mean is that in order to understand how farmers are using practices together, we identified farmers by grouping them based on how many practices and what practices are being used. So here you can see we have farmers that are using land use change along with tillage practices, crop rotation along with tillage practices, as well as cover cropping along with tillage practices. And so due to the structure of the data, however, we weren't able to estimate all of these practices in the same model. The limited years of cover cropping data required us to estimate that in a separate model. So here you can see in model 1, we include all the bundles that have a tillage practice along with crop rotation or land use change. And in model 2, we include the bundles that have crop rotation associated with them. We had very little observations of farmers that were using 3 or more practices. And so for ease of estimation, they were dropped from this analysis. I think out of 24,000 plus observations we had to work with, there were maybe 19 farmers using 3 or more carbon farming conservation practices. And so we separated the model using the years that the cover cropping data was available, as well as the years that all the other information on all the other crop practices were available. So kind of following the same logic we see in our previous table, as you look through time, we can see that the percentage of farmers that have begun using reduced or no-till practices has slowly been steadily increasing, and overall has started to, in combination, be more than the percentage of farmers using conventional tillage practices. There are some peaks and valleys at different points in time, given the different environmental factors that might have been at play or federal policy implications that might have been in action. But overall, we do see a steady downward trend in the use of conventional tillage practices when compared to reduced and no-till. As we look at our conservation practices across our crops, surveyed groups in the data set, we can see that overall, there's still a high percentage of farmers across our crops here using conventional tillage practices. However, for certain crops years that were surveyed, we do begin to see that the combined use of reduced and no-till practices is beginning to outpace that of conventional tillage. This is shown to be the case for wheat farmers, soybean, sorghum, very close for cotton and corn as well as barley. Then when we look at our other conservation carbon farming practices, we can see that overall crop rotation is the highest percentage used alternative practice. And this is a case across all the crop years surveyed from the ARMS data. Land use change tends to be particularly used with very specific crops such as cotton, soybeans, as well as wheat. And when we look at cover cropping, we still see very, very low percentage of usage, but it is present in crops such as barley, corn, cotton, oats, sorghum, and soybeans. And so now we're going to stop and take a minute to talk about the variables we estimated or used in our estimation process. I'm going to try my best to make sure I explain these very clearly, very plainly, because these variables are going to be used again in our later chapters. So I'm going to try to make sure that we get a good understanding of what they are now. We start with our farmer characteristics. So these are characteristics of the farm individual that could potentially influence their perception of the expected utility from certain carbon farming practices. So what we want to understand is, how does age affect the farmer's likelihood of using certain practices? How does their years of experience, their years of farming, impact their likelihood of use, as well as whether or not they're college educated, whether they are a part of the Caucasian majority or the non-white, Black, Indigenous, and people of color minority categories, as well as what's the size of their household, which might have implications for labor, as a lot of farm households use internal family labor in production. We also want to take a look at their farm characteristics. So here we want to evaluate how farm size impacts their likelihood of use, understanding what is the implications for larger versus smaller farms in terms of using certain practices or combination of practices, as well as the percentage of land on their farm that is dedicated to crop production specifically. We also want to take a look at the percentage of land that they own, as ownership has been shown in the literature to impact certain management decisions. Farms tend to be more willing to explore different options given that they own a larger portion of their land and aren't renting it temporarily in a given year. And we also want to explore the impact of livestock such as cattle, as that might have implications for different land use strategies in terms of where they produce versus where they pasture or graze their livestock. When we look at the next thing we want to evaluate is the climate and weather. So when we look at the literature on climate change, it's been shown that extreme temperatures tend to negatively impact yields. And so when we want to understand why or why not farmers might be using certain practices, we can think of it from the perspective of, does this farmer see see this practice or combination of practices as something that will protect them from increasing extreme temperatures, or something that leaves them vulnerable, something that maybe requires too many inputs for them to protect themselves, as well as what are the implications of precipitation. The one thing that I want to note here is that we have our climate, which is distinguished with this norm category, and our weather. So when we think about climate, we think about it from the perspective of what is the average temperature and average precipitation of a given area in a particular year, right? What is the very typical expected level of environmental factors that a farmer is producing under? When we talk about weather, we're talking about deviations from climate. So here it's how many additional days of either good growing conditions or harsh growing conditions a farmer is being exposed to. How much additional precipitation is a farmer receiving in a given year that may have them adjust their production strategies and management practices. And then with that being said, we constructed what's known as degree days, and we used an approach that's very prolific in the literature around climate change from Schlichter and Roberts, who created bins that allowed for the distinguishing of days of optimal growing conditions and days of extreme or harsh growing conditions. Here you see in Schlichter and Roberts that they identified a growing degree day, or a day that has optimal growing conditions, as a day where the temperature falls between 8 and 29 degrees Celsius. We use the modified version of that, where our optimal growing degree days is identified as days where the temperature is between 0 and 30 degrees Celsius. The reason for this is that for certain practices that involve using different crops, you might think to grow them in different parts of the year. Obviously, there's typically a growing season in agriculture that starts just after winter and ends just before, right in the middle of fall. But we also want to be able to account for how farmers are maybe making these management decisions, given that they are producing a winter crop, something like winter wheat or things like that. And again, the separation between our climate and our weather variables is what's going to allow us to distinguish between long-run average climate condition and short-term changes in the weather. We calculated this simply by subtracting the annual values of our calculated degree days and extreme degree days from the initial calculations. Our last category of variables that we'll be exploring is our soil characteristics. So these are characteristics of the soil in terms of structure or productivity level. Here we have an indicator for whether or not the field surveyed was identified as highly erodible. We also have an indicator for whether or not the field was considered or had wetland status. These both have implications for the erosion and how the structure of the soil may or may not hold under certain growing conditions. We also have the NCCPI, which is a productivity measure that the USDA NRCS often uses in order to grade the productivity of different soils in different regions. We have organic matter, which is a measure of the amount of leftover terrestrial vegetation that is present in the top layer of the soil that might be useful as nutrients come the next growing season, as well as the slope of the soil, getting an understanding for how the terrain structure impacts the ability to grow certain crops as well as use certain practices. And lastly, soil conductivity, which gives us an idea of the level of salinity that might be present in the soil at a given point in time. So when estimating our model, we clearly had a lot of variables that were being used. And a lot of times when we look at the literature, they try to, keep models short, sweet, and to the point and condensed. So in order to justify the inclusion of this many different category of variables, we ran consecutive iterations of the model, adding different variables from different groups and looking at the difference in the estimations and judging that with a likelihood ratio test. The results for this likelihood ratio test across all 4 iterations of our model were shown to be statistically significant, suggesting that the last model we landed on, which included all categories of variables, was the most effective at evaluating the variation in data. This has important implications because a lot of the literature on conservation practices focuses primarily on farmer and farm characteristics, right? But part of the issue that you face when you don't include enough environmental, climate, weather, and soil agronomic variables is that you have the potential to overestimate the true impact of the farmer and farm characteristics that are often used in the literature. And in doing so, you can draw conflated implications about what the true likelihood of using certain combinations of practices are. So from here, we're going to go ahead and step into our results from chapter 1. So just to give you a little bit of understanding of how I've displayed the results here, these are all the variables that were the most statistically significant across all of the bundles estimated in the model. Here, in parentheses, we give the number of particular bundles that particular variable was significant in, and we averaged the impact of their likelihood of influence on the decision to use certain practices in order to just get a broad perspective of what their overall impact is. Had I gone and thrown up the whole table, well, we'd be here all day just for chapter 1. So to spare you that, I decided to sort of condense that a little bit as best as I could. So when we explore the soil agronomic variables, we see that the soil productivity index was significant across 6 of our conservation bundles that were present in the model, having an average impact of 6.8 percentage points on the likelihood of use. This impact was shown to be positive for the bundle that included reduced till and crop rotation, but negative for bundles that included any tillage practice and land use change, crop rotation, or cover crops. This is interesting because it suggests that crop rotation is maybe a practice that is able to leverage the soil productivity a bit better than some of the other combinations of practices we have. We see that highly erodible fields was significant across 6 of our conservation bundles with an average impact of 2.3 percentage points. This impact was shown to be positive for bundles that included no-till, land use change, and or crop rotation, as well as reduced tillage and cover cropping, but negative in bundles that included conventional tillage and reduced tillage or land use change and crop rotation. Organic matter was seen to be significant across 5 of our conservation bundles with an average impact of about, little less than 1%, but it was positive across bundles that included conventional tillage and land use change or crop rotation, as well as reduced tillage and cover cropping, but negative in bundles that included no-till, crop rotation, and or cover croppings. Now, an important thing to note is that whenever we see a bundle where conventional tillage is the base tillage practice, the next practice coupled with that is actually the first carbon farming practice that farmer is implementing, right? Versus a situation where you have a farmer that's already using no-till or reduced tillage and then is also using cover cropping, crop rotation, or land use change. Soil slope was shown to have a significant impact across 8 of our our use bundles with an average impact of, again, little less than 1%. This was shown to be positive in bundles including tillage practices like no-till and reduced tillage with land use change, crop rotation, and cover crops, but negative when looking at conventional and reduced tillage with land use change or no-till with crop rotation. And lastly, soil conductivity. Again, the impact is small, but was shown to be significant across 5 of the adoption bundles and predominantly positive in bundles that included no-till, land use change, or any tillage paired with cover cropping. So what this is giving us an insight into is how the productivity levels and the structure of the soil impact a farmer's willingness to implement certain practices. The proclivity to use practices such as reduced and no tillage might come from a desire to protect from erosion, while the practices such as cover cropping and crop rotation might be more likely to be used by farmers with higher level of productive soils that can optimize continuing to grow their staple crop while also effectively incorporating a secondary crop. Or alternatively, it could also be the decision to, instead of shifting production towards the production of additional crops somewhere else, the farmer might be more willing to just continue to produce at a higher rate with their staple crop. So again, this just gives us a lot of insight into how the structure and productivity levels of the soils might influence a farmer's decision to use certain practices. Next, we're going to go on and look at the climate and weather variables. Here, we see that normal degree days was significant across about 7 of the adoption bundles. Small impact, but this impact was shown to be positive in bundles that included no-till, land use change, and crop rotation, as well as any tillage, along with cover cropping practices. Deviations in degree days, meaning how many additional optimal growing days did the farmer experience in the given year, was also shown to have roughly a 0.36% percentage point impact on the likelihood of using any tillage practice along with any additional conservation practice. So this is interesting because it seems to indicate that as growing conditions are more optimal, a farmer might be more willing to explore using different management practices, given that the threat of low yields is reduced because of the better growing conditions and temperatures that they might be facing in a given year. Now, when we go on to extreme degree days, we see that normal climate extreme degree days was significant across 6 of the adoption bundles with an average impact of about 2.3 percentage points. This was a positive impact when it came to bundles such as conventional tillage or reduced tillage with crop rotation, but negative with practices such as reduced tillage or no-till with land use change, crop rotation, or cover crops. Going on to deviations, we see that it was significant across 7 of our adoption bundles with an average impact of about 0.52 percentage points. And this was shown to be positive across any tillage, any bundle that included any tillage practice and land use change, but negative across any bundles that included any tillage practice and crop rotation or cover cropping. This is interesting because it seems to suggest that in the face of more extreme weather days, so more days where the average temperature is extremely higher than normal, farmers might be more willing to adjust their ratio of land in terms of where they're producing and maybe where they are pasturing cattle or things of that nature. But when it comes to practices that include continuing to grow additional crops, are maybe a little bit more conservative, possibly due to the additional input requirements of growing more crops in harsher conditions. Lastly, for weather, when we look at precipitation, we see that the normal and the deviation in precipitations were significant across nearly all the adoption bundles, with a very small overall average impact though. They showed to have an increasing marginal impact on bundles that included any tillage option and land use change, but a decreasing marginal impact across bundles using any tillage option and crop rotation or cover cropping. Again, the use of water in different intensive practices that require you to use precipitation and possibly irrigation differently varies with not only the potential of flood risk, but with the potential of possible loss in staple crop production due to trying to accommodate an additional crop. And lastly, when we look at the farmer and farm characteristics that were influencing the use of certain practices, we see that when it came to race, farmers that identified as Black, Indigenous, or people of color were shown to, farmers that identified this were shown to have an average of about a 2.85 percentage point impact on their likelihood of adopting certain bundles of practices. This is shown to be positive for practices such as reduced tillage and land use change, but negative for certain practices such as reduced tillage or cover cropping. I think this in a lot of ways maybe points to a gap in information that small limited resource minority farmers might be facing, as well as the potential for the historical disenfranchisement that these groups of farmers might have, been faced with through time, impacting not only the information they have on the benefits of using certain practices, but also impacting their willingness and trust in the different government or federal institutions that offer resources or support for implementing practices such as these. We see that household side was significant across 2 of the adoption bundles and had about a 0.3 0.35 percentage point impact. This impact was positive across bundles that included conventional tillage and crop rotation or cover cropping. Years farming was shown to have an average impact of a little less than 0.1%, but what we saw is that the likelihood varied across older and more experienced farmers. I think this is something that has huge implications for how we look at age in the literature as we're understanding farmers in U.S. agriculture. A lot of times when age is included, it is often used as a proxy for experience, so assuming that older farmers are also more experienced farmers. But what we saw in the analysis that we conducted was that the impact of years of farming was often very different than the impact of age. So while, yes, older farmers might have been less likely to adopt certain things or implement certain practices, more experienced farmers were. So if you're looking at two farmers that are both, let's say, about 50, which is just below the average age, the farmer with 25 years of farming experience might look at using certain management practices differently than the farmer with 35 years of experience in farming. And again, that just has, I think, very interesting implications for how we tend to look at age in our econometric analysis in agriculture economics. We will look at farm size. We see that it was significant across 5 of the adoption bundles that were included in this model, with an average impact of 1.24 percentage points per additional acre. So essentially what we saw is that impact grew as farms got larger. And this impact was shown to be positive for bundles that were including no-till as well as any of our other additional practices, but negative for bundles that included conventional tillage and crop rotation or cover crops. This is interesting because it suggests that farms that are larger, that have more land available, are a little bit more likely to use a wider variety of management practices. They have more land resources to spare and use to experiment and see how different combinations of practices not only affect the environment around those fields, but also impact their overall yields. And lastly, when we look at the percentage of land that was dedicated to crop production specifically, we saw that this was significant across 2 of our conservation practice bundles, with an average impact of about 3.75 percentage points. This was shown to be positive in conventional tillage bundles with crop rotation, as well as no tillage bundles with crop rotation. So here we're seeing when more crop land is available to be used, a farmer might be slightly more likely to implement alternative practices that involve growing additional crops outside their primary staple production crop. And so in conclusion on this chapter and this essay, we see that the results that were presented identify a clear relationship between the likelihood of using multiple carbon farming practices and shifts in climate and weather conditions. This likelihood of using complementary practices together tend to overall increase under ideal optimal growing conditions, which suggests that joint use is less likely as temperatures become a little bit more extreme. Joint use of certain practices was also shown to be impacted by the productivity and structure of the soil, suggesting that producers prioritize land and inputs into higher yielding fields overall on average. And so from a policy perspective, it's important to understand that encouraging the use or adoption of these conservation practices may require the additional establishment of certain incentive programs that consider input costs and potential risks to farmers. We've seen this in certain federal programs that deal with subsidies under certain insurance situations and things of that nature. And with that in mind, there's an opportunity for future research to explore the interactions between these independent variables. I would love to dive in deeper into this when it came to some of the soil characteristics and farm size or distribution of farm cropland, as well as possibly examine the sequential implementation of management practices. Typically with a lot of these practices, what we'll see is that the most simple or easy to use practice is often what's used first, followed by then a more more complex or input intensive practices. And so understanding the sequential relationship between certain groups of practices might allow us to better understand how to structure programs and certain incentive opportunities to encourage farmers in a particular way to guarantee that they're adding practices in production rather than using less. And lastly, there's an opportunity to explore the welfare implication. Here, we're taking a look and seeing how the use of certain combination of practices is influenced by farmer and farm characteristics. The next step from there would be then to compare farms that are and aren't using certain practices in order to understand what the financial implications are for certain carbon farming management strategies. And so that actually leads us into chapter 2, where we're going to analyze the welfare implication of these conservation management strategies. I'm going to stop a moment and take a drink because it already feels like I've been talking for an hour.
Only 55 minutes.
Only 55 minutes? I actually beat my record. Oh, yes. Let me get that off. Thank you, Doc. I appreciate that. Okay, so moving on to essay or chapter 2, now we're going to look at the welfare implications of conservation management practices in the U.S. So again, as we've mentioned in the introduction, in response to growing global interest in finding solutions to combat climate change, systems have been developed in order to offset emissions for various industries. Carbon credit programs, for example, are one way that farmers are currently being incentivized to use carbon sequestration practices for the purposes of offsetting emissions from other sectors. I actually just recently read an article like 2 days ago about Google buying something $2 million worth of offset credits in order to offset their own company's emission levels. And as of right now, there are several voluntary carbon credit programs that have either been started or in the process of being developed. If anybody's familiar with a company like Indigo Ag, I know True Terra in Land O'Lakes is also exploring some of these potential carbon credit system structures for their farmer cooperatives as well. However, the main challenge that comes from these particular forms of incentives is that there is still some debate on the ways and mechanisms and techniques to use to accurately measure and verify the amount of carbon sequestered. And there's a lot of different cost implications along with the equipment or inputs that might be needed in order to accurately measure the level of carbon sequestration. And this poses a number of different challenges, the main one being the risk of carbon reversal from disadoption. If these systems aren't set up in such a way that they can accurately measure and verify carbon so that farmers can get paid what they're owed for their particular conservation practices, they might decide, well, I'm not going to do this anymore. And in deciding to reverse those practices, you potentially reverse all the beneficial environmental changes that occurred because that farmer was using those practices. And so that basically means that carbon credit programs can't serve as the only motivation for farmers to use these practices. There's just too much that's still up in the air about the way these programs are structured and how to accurately and effectively compensate farmers for what they do. And so the big question is then, well, if we're trying to understand the need to incentivize farmers, we first must understand how certain practices impact their welfare overall. And this is what could help us understand ways to better structure and promote incentive programs on both the public and private sector to encourage the use of these practices. Evidence from this could assist policymakers on how to structure these different mechanisms in order to ensure that farmers are being equitably compensated and compensated in such a way that they do see the additional use of certain practices as an overall benefit to them. That leads us to our research question and objectives for chapter 2. What we're trying to understand is what are the welfare implications of carbon farming practices in the U.S. For U.S. producers. And in answering this question, we want to identify the current intensity levels of carbon farming practice usage in the US, evaluate the relationship between those carbon farming practices and farm welfare. And then we also want to examine differences in welfare for different levels of intensity for these conservation practices. So in the literature, whenever you're looking at a problem that deals with comparing two farmers or comparing two observations, a very common approach to answering questions in that space is the use of propensity score matching. This is a technique that was developed by Rosenbaum and Rubin in 1983, and it's basically an approach that, in essence, simulates a controlled experiment for non-randomly assigned groups of observation. What this will allow us to do is essentially take a look at two farmers and explore the differences between them from a welfare perspective, given that one farmer has been implementing certain carbon farming practices and another one hasn't. So seeing how the differences in their management production strategies relevant to these conservation practices impacts their overall financial welfare. And as you can see, this is an approach that has been prolifically used in the literature to answer similar questions. So again, conceptually, what we want to understand is how the presence of carbon farming practices impacts the overall productivity, financial welfare of a farm observation. So we're going to explore this problem from a profit maximization perspective. We're assuming that farmers are making decisions based on the overall goal of maximizing profit. And they maximize profit by producing the optimal output of goods, given their input usage and management strategies, while also minimizing the overall cost of production. These farmers making decisions relevant to what to produce each year, how much land to produce, and things of that nature are always having to weigh these two things, right? How do I produce the optimal level of goods while minimizing the overall cost to produce these goods in order to maximize my overall profit? And so what we're interested in here is seeing how the profit levels of two farms might be different, given that one of these farms has begun implementing certain carbon farming conservation practices and the other one hasn't. And so we want to evaluate how, in the face of different market prices, different costs of inputs and things of that nature, the presence or use of these conservation practices impacts the overall finances of the farm. This is important because a lot of these practices can be cost intensive. Even for the ones that might not have a direct cost in implementation, there might be associated costs with using that practice that a farmer has to consider. For example, a farmer using no-till, right, might have to plant or purchase additional planting equipment in order to make sure that the seeds of the crop that they're planting are down at a depth low enough to begin germination and things of that nature. So these are all the cost implications that are associated with these practices when a farmer is making a decision on what to and not to use. Also, another thing that we want to sort of be able to conceptualize in this analysis is how does a level of conservation intensity change, or how does your economic benefit change given your level of conservation intensity? When I say intensity, I mean whether or not you are using no practices, one practice, or two or more practices. The reason this is relevant is because a lot of the agronomic literature on these specific conservation practices recently has begun to suggest that using one practice is not enough to maximize the overall environmental benefits from those practices. Now, they've been moving to more of a framework of, hey, if you're going to do no-till, you maybe also need to use cover crops. You maybe also need to use a crop rotation strategy in order to gain the most amount of benefits from using those practices as possible. And so what we're interested in evaluating is, with that understanding, if we know that the environmental benefits aren't possibly maximized at that stage one of conservation practice intensity, where farmers may be only using a single practice, it also stands to reason that the economic benefits might not be being maximized as well. The first use of a lot of these practices requires a lot of initial cost, right? A lot of additional input use. If you're growing multiple different types of crops, you might now need more fertilizer. If you are, again, changing your tillage strategy, you might need new equipment to help you plant or cultivate your fields in a different way. And so what we also want to kind of test in this analysis is understanding where these environmental and economic benefits are sort of both maximized and converge in the presence of different levels of conservation intensity. And so, as I mentioned before, we are going to approach this question using a propensity score matching approach. Propensity score matching is a form of treatment effects estimation where we are evaluating or estimating the average treatment effect on the treated. Basically, what is the impact of that treatment on the farmer or on the individual that is using it? And this is found by taking the difference between the expected levels of your output, in this case, our profit variable of net farm income, and comparing the difference between the two. So here in this equation, we're looking at the difference in the expected profit levels of farmer 1 and farmer 0, given that farmer 1 has begun implementing some level of conservation practices in their production. And so we're going to evaluate this at 3 different levels. We're going to look at farms that haven't begun using any conservation practices, or conventional farms. We're going to look at farms that have begun using a single practice in production. And then we're also going to evaluate farms that have begun using multiple practices in production, and evaluate the difference in net farm income between those groups of farmers in order to understand what the potential impact of these conservation practices are on the financial welfare of farmers. So for our empirical model in this propensity score approach, it's very similar in essence to our multinomial model, our discrete choice model that we used in chapter 1. Here we're estimating the likelihood that a farmer is using no practices, a single practice, or multiple practices in production, given their unique farmer and farm characteristics. Now, we also included several groups of fixed effects that I will go into detail a little bit later on. When you're doing propensity score matching, what you're essentially doing is you are comparing farmers with similar characteristics in order to determine how, under similar conditions, the presence of a particular treatment or management decision does or doesn't make a certain difference. And so we also wanted to evaluate that and find ways to enhance the matching procedure of our propensity score estimation. Now, we use 3 particular approaches with this estimation procedure. The first 2 are the nearest neighbor and the kernel matching method. So these are the propensity score methods that are most commonly used in the literature. The nearest neighbor procedure involves matching an observation to its most like counterpart. So looking at farmer A, who is very similar to farmer B, with the only real noticeable difference being that farmer B has begun using some of these conservation practices and farmer A has not. We also use the kernel matching method. Now, this is a method that takes the weighted average across multiple untreated and treated observations in order to compare that. So rather than looking at one farmer and another farmer, you're looking at the average across multiple groups of farmers with similar characteristics, with, again, the only difference being that presence of the treatment in this case, which is the use of carbon farming practices. And lastly, we're also going to estimate this using an inverse probability weighted regression. This is going to be useful because this is what will allow us to compare across multiple levels. So with the kernel and the nearest neighbor matching method, you're only able to really compare between 2 distinct levels, 0 and 1, right? So 0 being farms that haven't used any conservation practices, 1 being farms that have. But here in the end, with the IPWR estimation, it'll allow us to run that estimation and comparison across all 3 levels of conservation practice intensity, meaning that we're going to get to compare across from farms that use no practices, and farms that use single and multiple practices in production. So again, the data that we're using here is very similar to the data. It's the same data set that we've been using in SA1. I'm getting a lot of use out of this data. If I ever need to come to, the USDA for anything, I know for a fact that I will be extremely familiar with the structure of some of their data sets, because myself and my colleague, Dr. Mike Rebecca Cameron Harp, we were in the weeds with this data set, trying to pull out as much as we could. And so when we look at the net farm income across the different conservation bundles that we used in essay 1, we see that there's a high level of variability in the mean and standard deviation for the net farm income, which in this situation would make estimating across all these different conservation bundles hard. This is why we decided to condense the estimation approach into comparing simply what farmers are conventional, what farmers are using a single practice, and what farmers are using multiple practices. When we look at it from that perspective, it gives us a much clearer picture of what the implication of some of these management decisions are. Here we can see the single practice farms tend to show a lower on average net farm income when compared to conventional and multi-practice farms. There's also a gap present between conventional and multi-practice farms in terms of their average net farm income. And this is the difference we want to test to see if it's significant in order to determine what the financial implications are for farms implementing conservation practices in their production. So when we're matching these farmers in order to draw comparison, we start by using a lot of the similar variables we used in essay 1. We're including things such as age, years of farming. So what this will allow us to do is this will allow us to compare across farms of similar age groups, similar experience, similar levels of education, similar personal demographics and personal demographic factors, as well as similar farm characteristics, right? Comparing farms that are reasonably the same size, right? So that the difference between them isn't being conflated by things other than the presence of the treatment, in this case, our carbon farming practices. Now, in addition to matching across farm characteristics, we decided to attempt to enhance the matching procedure by matching across a set of fixed effects. The purpose of these fixed effects is to try to make sure that we are comparing farmers that are facing similar environmental factors. The fixed effects we used here in this procedure were the farm resource regions developed by the USDA ERS. These are regions of the country that specialize in a specific type of agricultural production and are typically made up of similar groups of farms or types of farmers. So think the fruitful rim, for example, which is this area in green, these are parts of the regions of the country that specialize in fruit and tropical fruit production and vegetable production, versus the basin and range where there's very little cropland and there's a lot more range and pasture land. The purpose of this is to help us, like I said before, understand and compare farmers that are facing similar environmental conditions that impact their decision to use certain intensity levels of conservation practices. We have 2 more level of fixed effects that we used in order to match farmers. The second one is production specialty. This was an approach that was sort of propagated by Whitaker in 2009. Where we essentially group farmers based on similar production focuses. Their production focus is determined by whether or not that crop or series or category of crops accounts for greater than 50% of their total value of production from the farm itself, from the farm operation. Now, what this will allow us to do is match farmers across match farmers that might be making similar production decisions, right? So it's easy to think that a farmer that specializes in barley, oats, and wheat might be making different management decisions than a farmer that specializes in something like vegetables. So if we want to be able to understand the differences in the presence of carbon farming intensity, we want to compare farmers that are making similar production decisions. And lastly, we have our income groups, which was an approach developed by Livingston and Mishra in 2013. This groups farmers based on their average level of net farm income into 4 distinct groups. The reason this is relevant is because this has implications for economies of scale. Farmers at different economic levels might be making different decisions on how to use their inputs. A farmer that's making greater than, let's say, $250,000 a year might be more willing to look at using additional conservation practices because the cost of using those practices to him might not be that bad compared to a farmer that's possibly making less than $100,000 a year, right? If let's say if it costs $10,000 to implement a certain practice, $10,000 to somebody making less than $100,000 a year is different than $10,000 to somebody making over $250,000 a year. And so this allows us to experiment and compare across farms that might be making similar decisions from an economic perspective. So going into our results, we'll start by talking about the results from the propensity score estimation. Now, this was estimated using a probit model, and it's again, a very similar approach in the discrete choice that we saw in our previous chapter. Here, we're looking at the likelihood of a farmer using a single practice or multiple practices in conservation. And we can see that age across both groups tends to have a negative impact on a farmer's likelihood or propensity for using conservation practices. Something like race, however, for single practice farms tends to also show a negative impact of about 6.8 to 9.1 percentage points on average. Again, I think this is significant because it's showing us that even when it comes to the decision to adopt one practice, right, farmers that are from smaller, limited resource demographic groups are really not showing a proclivity to even explore these. And so I think some insights into there might be useful for programming structure in the future. We see years of farming having a small but positive impact on the likelihood of both occurring. So the likelihood of a farm using either a single or multiple practices in production. Farm size is also shown to be positive, indicating that larger farms are, again, more likely to be willing to implement practices into production because they have more space, more land resource. Similarly, with percentage of crop production, we're seeing that it has a pretty high positive percentage point impact on the likelihood of single or multi-practice conservation usage. Again, that distribution of land being influenced by the cropland that's available to that farmer. And lastly, the percentage of owned land was shown to be significant for multi-practice farms with a positive percentage point impact of about 4.2. This is suggesting that as farms get larger, agency is also important. A farm's ownership of the land that they're producing on seems to encourage the use of practices versus farmers that might be renting larger portions of their land. Okay, so now to the money. We're going to look at the impact of single practice use on net farm income. Here we have the estimated average treatment effects from the nearest neighbor and kernel matching models. Here you can see that the average income for conventional farms ranges between about $100,000 to $120,000 a year between our two models on average. That's when you're looking at farms that aren't using any practices in production, aren't diverting resources in any alternative way. And then when we look at single practice farms, we can see that on average, their income is a lot less, only just barely kind of touching $100,000. And so that estimated average treatment effect in the base model, which we see in the light green, was estimated to be about 15.9% in the nearest neighbor model and 18.3% in the kernel matching model. However, when we applied fixed effects, though the average treatment effect was still negative, it definitely lost a little bit of significance. But overall, what this is telling us is that single practice farms typically experience a lower net farm income on average when compared to conventional farms. So again, it's that question of how does the beginning use of a single practice impact the way you're having to now use inputs, having to now use machinery, and what is the cost implications of that? So moving on, here we decided to group single and conventional farms together and compare them to multi-practice farms. So here we can see that on average, the income between conventional and single practice farms is about $110,000 to $114,000 a year, whereas multi-practice farms is a little bit higher at about $120,000 annually. The average treatment effect on the treated in the base model was estimated to be about 8.5% or to 12%, depending on your model specification. And in the fixed effects model, it was shown to be about 11% or 7% difference. And this difference was shown to be positive, meaning that on average, the net farm income for multi-practice farms is a bit higher than the average from conventional and single practice farms. Now, obviously, based on the previous slide we just saw, we know that the average for conventional farms is being brought down a bit when they are grouped with single practice farms. So going from there, after understanding that multi-practice farms tend to have a higher net farm income when compared to those two groups together, next, we want to take a look at how across all three groups, the average net farm income behaves. That's where we use our inverse probability weighted regression analysis. Again, the major benefit to this is that it allows us to explore the differences across three different levels of conservation intensity. Here, the base level of intensity that was used as that point of comparison was single practice farms due to the high frequency of those observations in the data set. I think overall, 52% of the farms that were observed in the ARMS data were single practice farms, whereas like 18% were conventional farms and about 20-ish to 27-ish% were multi-practice farms. And so when we compare across all three groups, we see that the average treatment effect for conventional farms is about 3.9%, and the average treatment effect for multi-practice farms is about 9%, both being positive. So what this is telling us is that conventional farms and multi-practice farms are both experiencing a higher net farm income on average than single practice farms. Again, when we talk about the levels of conservation intensity and maximizing your benefits, getting to the multi-practice stage might be important because that allows you to start experiencing and receiving the overall joint benefits that come from leveraging certain practices together and how that might impact yield and the quality of your production. But this still just leaves us with a question, right? If we see that the income for conventional farms is still higher than multi-practice farms, what's the motivation to change what you're doing? What's the motivation to make a different decision? We see that this difference is about $4,000 on average, which would suggest that a subsidy or some incentive or support structure that is about that size would be needed to transition conventional farms to that multi-practice level. Again, the literature suggests that maximizing these environmental benefits comes from using practices together. And so in order to get them to that stage, it's not enough to just incentivize them to use one. You have to incentivize them in such a way that it transitions them from going to no practices directly to using multiple practices. And so to bring this together here in chapter 3, in our estimate of our propensity score and our probate model, we saw that farm characteristics significantly impact the propensity for using conservation practices, particularly farm size and cropland were shown to be positively influential in the likelihood of a farm choosing to implement a single or multiple practices in production. Single practice farms on average exhibited the lowest overall net farm income, and the income gap between conventional and multi-practice farms suggests that additional supports or incentives are needed in order to increase farm level intensity of conservation practices. And at the same time, continuing to encourage single practice farms to implement more practices in order to leverage the economic and environmental benefits of those different management strategies. With that being said, I think there's an opportunity for future research to evaluate the impact of federal incentive programs on conservation behavior. Things like the Farm Bill, which is updated on every 4 years, is a very important piece of legislation in the landscape of agriculture and has significant implications for farm behavior. This Farm Bill also includes, programs like the Conservation Reserve Program or the Environmental Quality Incentive Programs, which are programs that are designed to incentivize and support farmers using active land conservation management strategies. And so evaluating these these types of federal policies and programs, I think, will allow us to understand how they need to be structured in order to transition farms into higher levels of conservation intensity. With that being said, that will transition us into essay 3. I'm going to go ahead and take another drink and take another breath. And we'll go from there. Does anybody at this stage have any questions? I know we can wait to the end if that works better for everybody. I feel like I've already kind of been here too long, so maybe we just keep going, huh? All right. We do. So let's just get to it. So with that being said, the future research mentioned at the end of essay 2 leads us into the research here we have in essay 3, where we're assessing the impact of policy reform on conservation management behaviors in the U.S. So conservation practices can be cost intensive. We've heard this over and over again in the literature on the agronomic and the economic side. And it can also be financially risky for farmers who often have to try their best to conserve more expensive resources. So to combat this, governments have attempted to implement policies and programs that encourage conservation activities through farm support and address growing environmental concerns. Conservation programs do this in a variety of ways, particularly through cost-sharing opportunities or subsidies that reduce the financial stress of implementing these practices. Now, when we talk about agriculture policy in the U.S., you cannot talk about agriculture policy in the U.S. without talking about the Farm Bill. This is a critical piece of legislation that influences the agriculture sector in our country. It's updated on a 4-year basis. And it has the goal of providing support systems for agriculture and producers through the development of safety nets, opportunities for loans, conservation, as well as disaster assistance programming. Farm Bill legislation has led to the development of several key programs that are used to help encourage the protection of the environment in agricultural production, things like the Conservation Reserve Program, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and the Conservation Stewardship Program. These are just some of just a few of the programs that the Farm Bill has either implemented or cycled through in its existence. Again, with the goal of offering financial incentives for farmers to implement and maintain these practices in their production. Now, when you look at the Farm Bill revisions that have occurred through time, one particular revision year stood out to me, and that was the 2014 Farm Bill revision. The reason that this bill stood out to me was because of how it shifted the landscape of federal support for conservation activities in agriculture. This Farm Bill had a lot of heavy programs consolidation in order to streamline the allocation of financial resources. We saw certain programs like the Regional Conservation Partnership Program or the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program either be shrunk, consolidated, or completely phased out. It also linked insurance premium subsidies to conservation compliance for highly erodible land and wetland fields for the first time. Funding for passive conservation efforts just continued to sort of shift away and drastically design. And in contrast, funding for active working land conservation programs received increased funding. These are programs like your EQIP and CSP programs that pay or that support farmers implementing these practices on an annual basis in their production. In addition, it also expanded the enrollment acres for a lot of these programs by about 10 million on average, and it extended a lot of the 5-year contracts that were already in place. So a lot of farmers that had contracts for using certain practices already in these programs got an extension. The U.S. government, the federal government, USDA said, hey, we want you to keep doing this for 5 more years. And so with that in mind, as we understand the landscape of conservation policy in the U.S., that brings us to the research question, which is we want to understand what the impact was of the 2014 Farm Bill on conservation activities in the U.S. And our goals are to estimate the change in the use of these practices through time due to the policy, as well as estimate the change in land allocation. So not only are these practices being used, but how much land are they being used on? And lastly, we wanted to explore any differences or regional heterogeneity in practice use and land allocation across the country. So we can see that there's actually a very recent resurgence in research looking at the impact of federal programming. And it's brought about a lot of implications on the way the structure of programs impacts farm behaviors. Things like reducing rental rates for certain programs was shown to decrease enrollment and therefore roll back the environmental benefits. But increasing the enrollment cap allowed more farmers to begin entering some of these programs and resulted in an environmental benefit increase that was double what was lost from the rental rate reduction. So what we're seeing here is that program structure matters. Not only how much are farmers getting paid, but also how many farmers and how much land is allowed to be entered into the program. We're seeing things like equip payments having a positive effect on, to certain practices, but the payments from CSP having a negative effect on the use of those practices across wider spans of acreage. So again, that program structure being relevant to how farms behave in terms of their overall conservation activity. And so now we run into a problem because we are continuing to use the ARMS data. And while the ARMS data is a very, very powerful and robust data set, there are some limitations. One thing that we're often, told in class, for example, no data set is perfect. Every data set has challenges and obstacles that need to be overcome. And so with the ARMS data, we understand the way that it is sort of collected. Every year, a new sample of farmers is surveyed at random based on the primary crop of interest for that year. So let's say in 2002, the focus is soybeans. We're surveying soybean farmers in 2002. We moved to 2003. Now we're interested in corn. So we're looking at corn farmers in 2003, going on and on and on until we maybe come back to soybeans again later, some years down the road. And so, but when that crop is surveyed again, there's really no guarantee that a farm that was surveyed in one crop year will appear in the data set the next time that crop comes to be surveyed. So just because we observed Farmer Patrick in the 2020 or the 2002 soybean survey doesn't mean that we'll see him again in the next soybean survey that's had. And so because of this, there's really no way to observe the same farmer over time, which means that we can't on an individual level determine how farms are responding to government policy through time. And again, cross-sectional estimation is an option. It's something that we've explored in my previous two essays, but it doesn't give us a way to see how things are changing over time. However, the literature on this problem, a lot of researchers have developed a strategy or been working to further develop a strategy to combat this particular type of challenge, which is the pseudo-panel approach. Now, this was an approach developed by Dalton in 1985 that involves drawing from a series of repeated cross-sections to create cohorts. Basically, you pull farmers from these individual cross-sectional points of data and you group them together based on having similar characteristics. From there, your cohorts serve as sample units for those individuals with similar characteristics. And then you conduct an estimation with your model by using that observed cohort value as your point of observation, which then creates the pseudo panel. So rather than trying to look at Farmer Patrick in 2002, 2003, 2004, we look across all those years and say, hey, what are the groups of farmers that are similar to Farmer Patrick through time, and compare that group average across those different years rather than the individual farm. So this has been applied to a number of different estimation techniques. And what they found in the literature is that when you group individuals like this, it's very similar to instrumental variable estimation and can satisfy conditions for consistent estimation as long as the cohorts are defined such that they can, and an individual can only appear in one. Meaning that if we happen to see Farmer Patrick again, he can't be assigned to a different group. If we see Farmer Patrick in one group at time 1, we need to see him in the same group at time 3, 4, or 5. And so in order to determine what ways to effectively group farmers, studies using this approach with the ARM data have formed these cohorts based on a variety of characteristics such as fixed assets, acreage, revenue groupings, as well as production specialty. And so going on, we're going to try to conceptualize this problem. Now, the conceptual framework here pulls elements from the frameworks from our previous 2 chapters. What we're interested in seeing is how the level of conservation activity, right, is observing what the level of conservation activity is given that a farmer is using a certain conservation bundle. So in essence, thinking back to essay 1, we know that a farmer is considering what practices to use based on the expected utility he anticipates receiving from those practices. In essay 2, we understood that that farmer also has to evaluate the cost and financial implications. So what we see here is that the level of conservation activity that a farmer is likely to exhibit is a function of the utility they anticipate receiving from those practices, and minus the cost of using those combinations of practices. Our utility function here that we see for the combination of practices is very similar that it is to essay 1 with 2 key differences. The first is the time signature, which is now letting us know that farmers are evaluating utility at different points in time. So I'm no longer thinking about, well, what's my utility just going to be if I use these practices now? I'm also thinking about what's my utility going to be if I'm using these practices a year from now, 2 years from now, things of that nature. And when it comes to the factors that are relevant to that decision, we're also seeing that acreage, we're adding this indicator for acreage applied to conservation. When it comes to overall conservation activities, farmers have 2 decisions that they can make, right? They can either decide, hey, I'm using one practice, I'm going to use an additional practice, or they can decide, I don't want to use any more practices, but I might have more land that I'm willing to use my current set of practices on. So this is now allowing them to augment their utility in 2 different distinct ways. And so what we see here in this equation is that the overall goal of the government is to intervene at time t such that the utility, such that the overall level of conservation activity before time t is greater than that of the conservation activity after time t. And in order to satisfy this, the utility received plus that government policy intervention needs to be greater than the cost associated with using those policies, and the utility of those practices needs to be greater than it would have been before the intervention, right? So if a farmer doesn't think that they're going to get any additional benefits from using these practices, even in the face of a government policy intervention, they're less likely to switch versus a farmer that might think, oh, I'm actually going to be better off if I apply for this program, get this funding assistance in order to implement these practices. And again, they're making these decisions based on their very specific demographic variables and environmental factors that they are faced with. And so this brings us to our empirical model. Here, we're going to estimate the level of the amount of conservation activity across our different cohorts. So what you see here, where our YCT bar, that is the average amount of conservation activity that cohort C is exhibiting. And this conservation activity is going to come in 2 forms: the average number of practices used by that cohort, by farmers within that cohort, and the average conservation acres that cohort is exhibiting. We're again going to estimate this very similarly that we have with our previous chapters, looking at the farmer and farm characteristics as well as the environmental factors. The big thing to note in our equation here is our time indicator. This is the indicator that's going to allow us to distinguish between the years pre and post policy. So here we're going to look at the level of conservation activity before 2014 and after in order to understand and determine if there's a notable difference between the 2. So when we went on to construct our cohorts, we used an approach very similar to Whitaker. He grouped farmers based on similar state and production specialties. If you'll remember, we used production specialties in SA2 in order to help match farmers making similar management decisions. This is very similar. We're looking to see group farmers based on those who have to make similar management decisions depending on their primary crop of interest. This also has important implications for one of the conditions necessary to satisfy pseudopanel requirements when it comes to a farm appearing in multiple categories. If we happen to observe a farmer more than once, he can't now all of a sudden be in a different category. The idea with that production specialty is that the groups here require very similar management technologies and strategies for production. So a farm that's in category 1, let's say, might decide to switch between barley, oats, and wheat, but they're far less likely to just go ahead and switch to vegetables because of the new strategies and production requirements of jumping into a completely new specialty overall. So grouping the farmers like this with the data set we had led to the construction of 28 cohorts across 16 years of data, providing us with about 1,700 observations to work with in our estimation. So when we go to estimate the equation, we start by understanding what our dependent variable looks like. We have 3 dependent variables that we're working with in our models. The first is number of conservation practices. Again, similar to essay 2, we're looking at it based on whether a farm is using no practices, 1 or multiple practices in production. We're also looking at the amount of acres they've applied to conservation, as well as the percentage of land allocated to conservation. If if your farm gets larger, you might be able to add more acreage, but if you're working with the same amount of land, how do you maybe determine what ratio of land to dedicate to conservation? Both of these, the land dependent variables, are going to be estimated using an OLS model. However, when it comes to the number of conservation practices, we're going to use 3 different models in our estimation approach. The first is the OLS estimation, and the thing to note about this when we're using this in a pseudopanel framework is that our discrete grouping variables that we used in our previous chapter, where a farm is maybe either 0 practice, 1 practice, or multi-practice farms, now overall for the cohort take the form of a bounded continuous variable. So a cohort might exhibit a level anywhere between 0 and a number anywhere between 0 and 2 when it comes to number of practices, and that number is indicating the mix or proportion of farms in that cohort that are using certain level of practices. So here, if you're looking at a farm that's valued somewhere between, or a cohort that's valued between 1 and 2, that means that that cohort is made up of a mix of farms that are using a single practice or multiple practices in conservation, creating that sort of bounded continuous dependent variable. We also used a fractional logit regression to shift that into more of a proportion. So here, we see that lower proportions experienced in conservation activity mean that that cohort has less farms in it that are using certain practices. The higher proportion, the greater amount of farms within that cohort that are using these conservation practices. And lastly, we use the Poisson regression as well. This allowed us to do just more of like a frequency count. So rather than this proportion across the different levels of conservation intensity, it was strictly how many farms in this cohort we're using different conservation practices overall. We're using a lot of the same variables that we used in our first essay when it comes to our farmer characteristics, farm characteristics, as well as reintroducing our climate and weather variables as well. This will allow us to understand how conservation as activity is changing through time in the presence of changing climate and weather conditions. We also wanted to explore regional heterogeneity, and we did that by applying fixed effects to the model. Similarly to essay 2, we're using the fixed effects of the farm resource regions, grouping farms based on similar, production areas, as well as the production expenditure reasons that NASS typically uses when evaluating the behaviors of U.S. farms on a regular basis. So, moving on to our results, we see that when it comes to conservation practice use, overall, when we look at the years after the 2014 Farm Bill reform, there was about a 33 to 38% increase in overall conservation activity. This is meaning that the farmers within the cohorts on average were beginning to use more practices in production after 2014 than before. One of the balance checks that kind of works for us in this situation is the estimation from the OLS and the fractional regression. the literature on fractional regression tends to suggest that when correctly specified, it pretty much gives you the same estimate that you would get from an OLS model, which is what we see here. When we look at the farmer and farm characteristics relevant to level of conservation activity in terms of number of practices used, we see again, age has that negative impact on conservation activity, whereas farm size has this positive impact. We're actually seeing now that cropland and own percent had a negative impact on the number of farms within a cohort that are using these conservation practices, where the presence of cattle had a small but positive impact as well. Looking at the weather and climate variables, we see that growing degree days, as well as deviations in degree days, both positively contributed to the use of conservation practices within these cohorts, whereas normal, extreme, and deviations in degree days had a negative impact as well. This is very similar to what we're seeing in our first two chapters, where optimal growing conditions leads farmers to be more willing to use certain practices and strategies, while harmful growing conditions means that leads them to be a little less willing to take on that risk. And again, here with precipitation, we're seeing it has a sort of decreasing marginal effect as you go from precipitation to precipitation squared, meaning that as long as they're getting amount of rain and precipitation that they can manage, they're sort of open to using different, the amount of practices being used is increasing, but it starts to come down as the risk of flooding becomes present. And so when we look at this treatment estimate, the estimation from our treatment year, and we see that there's this increase in overall number of practices used within cohorts, it still begs the question, where is this occurring? Is this occurring from farms that are implementing, and maybe starting to use their first practice in production? Or is this occurring in farms that are already using one practice and have started transitioning to higher levels of intensity? Running a similar model to that to our first one, but instead here using the indicators for single and multi-practice usage for our farms, we can see that a lot of this positive increased use in conservation activity is coming from our multi-practice farms. This means that we're not really seeing a big increase in the amount of farmers that are using a single practice within the cohorts, but we are seeing an increase in the farmers within the cohorts that have started transitioning to using practices at higher intensity levels. Going on to land allocation, we can see that farm size and cattle are both positive in terms of their impact on the amount of acreages applied to conservation activity, as well as cropland. Again, we're seeing that larger farms with more percentages of croplands are using these practices at a higher rate. When we look at, again, the climate and weather variables, we see that our normal extreme degree days and our precipitation have a negative impact on the amount of land allocated to conservation, but our deviation in degree days had a positive impact. So here we're seeing actually that as farmers within cohorts began experiencing more extreme temperatures, even if they weren't using additional practices for the practices they were using, they might have started now shifting to using them on wider portions of land. And as we look at the indicator variable for our effect post 2014, seeing about a 30% increase in the amount of land dedicated to conservation across farmers within cohorts through time. And so we also wanted to explore any regional heterogeneity, any differences across regions of the country, and we did this by specifying different groups of cohorts based on the farm resource regions and the NAS regions in order to estimate this effect. We did see that the effect was consistent with what we saw in our previous models, with about a 38 to 40% increase in conservation practice use. However, with these two models, the standard errors were slightly higher. The reason for that being is that when you create cohorts, it does act similarly to fixed effects when you are running it in an estimation. And so the use of an additional fixed effect for the same thing might have introduced a bit of endogeneity. However, we wouldn't have been able to isolate those impacts without adding that effect. But even in the presence of that effect, we're seeing that the estimation is consistent with the estimations we received from our previous models, which is just good for us because it suggests that we were effective in how we established our cohorts in this pseudo panel. So when we explore the regional heterogeneity across the farm production expenditure regions, we can see that the Midwest and the West were the only two regions with any significant, sort of difference in level of conservation use when compared to the Atlantic region. And it was shown to be negative. When you think about what these two regions encompass, the logic makes sense. The Western region of the U.S. Tends to comprise a lot of rangeland, pasture land, things of that nature, land that's not necessarily used specifically for crop production. Whereas the Midwest, we have our I-states, the Corn Belt there, where we have a high level of production consolidation for crops like corn, which might mean that farmers in those areas just are making, producing so well at their current level that they're just less willing to implement additional practices. When we look at the regional heterogeneity across our farm resource regions, we see again something very similar in terms of that western area with the Basin Range region that overlaps with that western area having a distinct negative, or having farmers in that region having distinctly less conservation activity overall, as well as farmers in the fruitful rim region. A reason for this is likely being that the conservation practices we've been evaluating in this research up until this point in time don't really fit in well with the structure of production for tropical fruits or vegetables that the fruitful rim region is typically known for. However, when we did explore the interaction across these regions after 2014, the one region that did have a distinct difference in their level of conservation activity was the southern seaboard region. This is the region of the U.S. this is the production region of the U.S. that encompasses the Carolinas, Alabama, Mississippi, Maryland, Texas, kind of, touches a lot of different states around that southeastern area, and it's primarily made up of a mix of large and small farms with that typically focus in field crop production. So we are seeing that farmers in this region did begin to increase their level of conservation practice usage after the 2014 Farm Bill reform. Which brings us to our conclusions for SH3. We saw that conservation activity by U.S. farmers significantly increased following the revision of the 2014 Farm Bill. The enrollment in acres for EQIP and conservation stewardship programs encouraged new participation. So we saw some farmers that were now maybe entering in and starting to apply for these programs, getting the benefits from them, and then begin implementing these different conservation practices on wider spaces of land. Contract extensions also were able to help with keeping current program participants active in their current level of conservation practice activity. We saw that the southern seaboard region overall had the most notable increase in conservation activities after 2014. And just in terms of how we used our pseudo-panel approach, the consistent results we saw across all of our models did suggest that we effectively leveraged the pseudo-panel environment in our estimation, even across our different techniques and model specifications. And so with that being said, I will try to wrap this up quick with final conclusions, because I definitely took too long. So overall, this dissertation that I've been working on contributed, I feel, to the landscape of conservation, agriculture, and agriculture economics empirical analysis in very significant ways when it comes to the use of certain conservation practices, the welfare associated with the use of certain practices, and the policy implications of how U.S. policy influences conservation activity. We've expanded the literature in several key areas that are relevant to the analysis methods that we use, and the results, I think, help reveal clear considerations for the current landscape of conservation, and that information can be very impactful when it comes to informing federal policies. Just giving a quick overview of the different things we touched on in our essays. Again, essay 1, we're looking at these factors that contribute to the use of certain practices, finding that the climate and soil and weather variables and farm characteristics are impactful, but it's important from an empirical standpoint to make sure that you include relevant meteorological meteorological and agronomic soil variables in order to avoid overestimating the impact of your farmer and farm characteristics. Our propensity score matching approach in SA2 did show that the average net farm income per single practice farms was statistically lower compared to or significantly lower compared to conventional and multiple practice farms. And that gap between the conventional and multi-practice farms needs to be addressed if we're going to be able to effectively incentivize farmers to continue increasing their levels of conservation activities. We also explore ways that the propensity score matching approach could be used with fixed effects in order to refine the matching procedures. And lastly, we used the pseudo-panel approach to evaluate the impact of the 2014 Farm Bill on conservation behaviors, finding that conservation activity did notably increase after 2014, following the expansion of enrollment acres and that shift in creating incentives for working land. And we also explored different estimation techniques and pseudo-panel cohort constructions in the analysis. I think as you know, the USDA ARMS data has a lot of key useful insights in terms of what it can tell us about farm activity, farm production, and things of that nature, and finding ways to overcome the limits of that data is just going to be extremely important and relevant for us as academics and on the federal level. And so where do we go from here? I think future research on some areas that I would like to step into going forward into this area is evaluating trends in use and adoption as new management strategies and production techniques are being developed in the conservation space. Things like biochar and pulverized rock dust application have become two sort of techniques of interest when it comes to practices that are, carbon friendly and helpful for the environment. And I think the interesting thing here is that depending on where a farmer is being able to acquire those materials, this might be something that scales better to small farms, since we were seeing a lot of large farms tend to adopt these other practices that were a little bit more cost and input intensive. We explored there's going to be a need to continue to explore farm finances and welfare as new incentive programs are developed. Again, we're seeing the development and the restructuring and shifting of a lot of carbon credit programs like now. I know Indigo Ag, for example, just experienced a very, very big shift in the structure of how their company offers benefits and incentives for farms, doing these different practices. And a lot of that's going to come down to the way the carbon sequestered is measured and the pricing of offset credits. And I think research on these topics into the future can ensure that these programs that are designed to incentivize farmers to encourage the increase in conservation activity are equitable and account for the risks and financial responsibility that a farm would be taking on if they were to implement some of these different production management strategies. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you all bearing with me on this. I'd like to just take a moment to thank my major professor, Dr. Tim Dalton. It's been a pleasure working with you, sir. I've learned a lot, and I've really enjoyed my experience as your student here in this department. Thank you to my committee members for your time. I know there were times where I came to a lot of you with, some of you with my problems. Dr. Tack, extremely helpful insight on, whenever I got stuck on my estimation approach. I appreciate being able to talk to you and sort of brainstorm different ideas on how to move forward. I'd like to thank two of my upperclassmen, Dr. Lonnie Hobbs Jr. and Dr. Micah Camera Harp. These are two of my upperclassmen that I've had the most opportunity to work with here in my time at Kansas State University, and I'm excited to stand beside them finally as colleagues. Last name mentioned, I would like to thank Dr. Rich Llewellyn. My time working with him in the Tax Institute here at Kansas State University helped me really sort of zero in and narrow down where I want to go in the future in terms of my career. Am I allowed to tell them the good news? And so, yeah, I figured, so I'm like, let me ask. With that being said, I'd like to also thank North Carolina A&T University, their cooperative extension department, because I have officially accepted a job as an assistant professor in extension at that university. So I'm very, very much looking forward to exploring some of these problems in my professional career. Thank you very much for your time. I now open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Raymond. I knew when we went over his presentation with these people all. I said, well, if you can cut it back, or I'm just gonna let you do your thing, right? Do yourself, or you're gonna succeed. And while it certainly was long, I think you had a lot of important information to convey. And I think you kept us all at the edge of our seats, or at least mine. I said the edge of my seat. I do want to reiterate to all of you sitting right here in the positions you're right now, it takes hard work. It took 6 years for Raymond to be from where you are to becoming an assistant professor at North Carolina A&T. And that's an incredible accomplishment for so many of our students that are here. Not all of them get the same opportunity that he has earned. So great for that. Now, questions. You can ask any questions about the presentation, or if you're, okay, we'll start right here. Everybody's allowed to ask questions.
I have agricultural zones, in terms of things that were those relevant, or were they so dispersed that was, or are the agricultural zones tantamount to what you mentioned in section 2, were grouped into crops?
Yeah, so,
Repeat that for the
yes, so he was asking, I think they can hear me. Do I have the mic on me? Yes. I do.
it should still be on.
So the question was, how are the agricultural zones relevant to some of the things we saw in this presentation in terms of conservation activities? Going back to, if we take a look back at our table, I think it is relevant because overall we do see that a lot of these agricultural zones, these farm resource regions, you know, they have a negative overall, they have less overall conservation activity compared to the Heartland region, which was used as the base. I think the biggest point of relevancy when it comes to these agricultural zones is understanding how the management decisions of farmers for different crop specialties impact the likelihood of using certain production management strategies for conservation. In areas where we tended to see a lot of you know, condensed production of staple crops and grains and things of that nature, farmers in those areas were just overall less willing to transition out. They were focused primarily on continuing to produce their staple crop to meet their bottom line, where we saw areas that have a little bit more diversification in their overall crop specialization, being a little bit more willing to implement new strategies that involved growing crops together or growing crops in different orders throughout the year. And a lot of that is also driven by the soil factors. You think about the Western region of the US, if it's not a mountain, it's a desert, you know, so there's not a lot of arable land to actually work with in those areas versus as you start moving east in the US. And so it just gives us insight into how the environment that a farm is producing in might influence how they're making certain production management decisions.
Raymond, great presentation. I have a question passed on from Dr. Hobbs, who had to leave. He said, great presentation, sir. In essay 1, he noticed that you didn't include geographical or location fixed effects, but you did include them in essay 2 and 3. What's your rationale behind not including them in essay 1? And do you see your results or implications changing if you had included them?
That's actually a very good question. And I would honestly say no. So the question was, the regional factors weren't included in essay 2 and 3, or they were included in essay 2 and 3, but they weren't included in essay 1. What was the reason for that? Typically, when you're looking at the literature around the use of fixed effects, they are designed to account for those specific regional differences. So including fixed effects does account for the fact that the soil agronomic conditions in one region of the country is different than the agronomic conditions in another. The reason I decided to isolate those particular soil characteristics in essay 1 was because I was trying to see and understand the relationship between different very specific aspects of the soil and how they did or didn't lend themselves to increasing the amount of practices used. I think also that the fixed effects, the biggest function of the fixed effects in essay 2 was the matching, right? So we wanted to make sure we were matching farmers in similar environments. So those soil factors are being considered. Just isolating them in essay one allowed us to identify those very more specific relationship between practices and the decision to the practices and the soil characteristics.
And then question of my own. So I thought it was really interesting in essay one that you mentioned the differences between BIPOC farmers, right? And how they're less likely to adopt different practices. And you mentioned different just historical perspectives on that. And then in essay two, you mentioned that $4,000 incentive just estimate. And you ended it by saying equitable programming is needed across all populations. So how do you see that incentive changing between different demographic groups just based upon what you found in essay one?
It's a good question. It's less that I think the incentive would change and more that I think that information about the presence of incentives is what needs to change. Typically, these programs don't distinguish, don't discriminate across, these different BIPOC categories. Any farmer is allowed to apply for any program. Nobody's stopping you. However, I think when it comes to these, the BIPOC farmers, we face two specific issues. One is education, meaning are they actually informed that these programs exist? And two is knowledge of entry, which is, are they aware of the requirements needed to enter these programs? You look at it from a historical perspective, not all groups of people were allowed to use the same resources at the same time. And I think in a lot of ways, when it comes to these BIPOC farmers, we're still experiencing that lagged effect of understanding that these resources are available and are useful if you understand how to find them and apply for them. So in a general perspective, I think it's less about the actual incentive in that area and more about, are these farms being informed? Are smaller scale minority farmers being informed about or aware of the presence of these opportunities in general?
You could tell the online folks either put it in the chat or you could unmute that thing that we muted earlier.
Yes, if there are any questions that you guys have, please feel free to put it in the chat. I think it's just easier if we read them from the chat.
That's fine.
Mostly just comments there.
Yes. Okay.
Got it, but
I think we're
We
good.
have one more here.
Yeah, I was gonna ask on essay one, I saw a reference to someone from Ethiopia. Your base data is, you mentioned USDA data, so I assumed it's all United States, right?
Yes.
So the reference to the Ethiopian, I assume, was more in reference to what were you calling it? Well,
The
I mean,
discrete choice analysis methods.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the reason I referenced that article, that was Majistu and Estafa
Yes,
2019.
Majistu.
Yes, is because they were using a very similar approach to what we wanted to do in essay one. And so the reason I looked at that was because I was interested in the variables that they had used in estimating the likelihood of use of the practices that were relevant in Ethiopia, just to see if there was any sort of variables that we could use that might be relevant to that same landscape, but in regards to the US.
Okay, got you.
Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, the last question,
There you go.
I'm waiting on him. I know he's gonna ask.
I'll lay it down there.
Where do you think I get it from?
So you got to limit yourself to an hour and a half.
Do I have to ask a question?
No, you do not.
Okay,
Absolutely not.
all
I
right.
just
So,
wanted-
so I don't have a question. My
You want-
wife just
I
asked
want
me
to
that.
clean socks on
Yeah.
today or something.
No, I really would just like to say you did an excellent job. I actually have asked all my questions in the middle of the night, 11, 12 o'clock. We're talking, and I'm probing and I'm asking, well, did Dr. Dalton, did Dr. Wiley ask you this, ask you that? So, no, I don't actually have any relevant questions right now because I have all the answers. There you go.
I think all of you, with that, I think you really confirmed what I believe is that Raymond's an excellent communicator. He's going to do an excellent job in front of students or in front of extension audiences. I got a little bit worried. Did everybody see that little thing flashing, that little flashing in front, warning temperature? I was like, is that the projector? Is that Raymond?
I wasn't sure because I was getting pretty heated, so.
Long presentation, you communicated extremely effectively. Let's give Raymond a round. of applause. I'm gonna ask the committee to stay and then